Hello, I'm Dr. Lisa Belisle, and you are listening to or watching Radio Maine, where we explore creativity and the human spirit. And we are sponsored by the Portland Art Gallery in Portland, Maine. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Todd Otten, who is not currently in Maine, but does have a Maine connection. Dr. Otten is a board-certified family physician with over 20 years of experience in healthcare. As a co-founder of our Quadruple Aim, he is dedicated to challenging the status quo in healthcare by promoting patient experience, quality care, lower costs, and provider wellness. Todd's distinguished career includes recognition as a Naval Flight Surgeon of the Year in 2006. He co-authored Ripple of Change, a book that he wrote with his patient, actually, sharing insights on burnout and systemic dysfunction in the industry. But really, that's just part of the story, Todd, because I think what I'm hearing from Ripple of Change is that you're looking for kind of a positive way through. Correct me if I'm wrong, and welcome.
Well, and thank you for having me. And you are spot on that we need to find a positive way through. And I often say that I'm a positive disruptor, I suppose. And really, what we were trying to accomplish with the book was to inspire and empower everyone to play their part. I think if we have patients, clinicians, administrators, if everybody does a little bit of something in a positive direction within the healthcare space, we can really start to move the needle. But it's going to take it's going to take a lot of us for sure.
When I read your book, which you co-authored with Joshua Judy, there are many pieces of it that I could certainly relate to. I mean, you and I share a long, similar parallel paths in family medicine, for one thing. But I also think that many of us who have gone through and have been practicing for a number of years have experienced the ups and downs, and probably more than once, of working within a system that doesn't always seem inclined favorably toward people who are trying to provide care, nor does it seem to be inclined favorably toward people who are trying to receive care. But I'm interested in part because I think that what you wrote was probably one of the best descriptions of actual burnout and probably recovery from burnout that I've probably ever read. So talk to me about your experience with that. I know it's kind of a trigger word these days, but what you went through was very powerful.
Oh yeah, I even just every time I go back to it, my mind it brings back some emotions, right? Um, I love being a physician. I love seeing patients. It's such a joy. And when the days are going well, it's magical. It's like the best job in the world. But you're right. There were instances, particularly in 2019, as this transition was going on, where I was starting to struggle with burnout. And at the time, I think subconsciously I knew it. Maybe I didn't want to admit it based on training or what have you. But I was getting short. I was getting angry. I was getting frustrated. The happy-go-lucky, enjoying the day, trying to inject humor guy had slowly disappeared. And I distinctly remember sitting in my backyard in tears, hating the job that I loved. I hated it. I hated going to work. I hated seeing patients. And these are people I loved. I had taken care of for a decade at this emotional just talking about it now. It's hard to describe. Um, but I think the reason I started writing, I think initially was the catharsis for myself. I suppose it took a good 2 years to really recover from that episode. And this was with counseling and this was being more open about it. I mean, 2 years to kind of get back what I thought was some semblance of normalcy. Um, and I wrote a poem called Medicine is a World of Gray. And it was kind of a really dark, somewhat despondent look at what really happens in primary care on a day to day basis. When I wrote Anatomy of Burnout, that was the start of some healing for myself. But when Joshua Judy got involved with this, it took on a very different trajectory in terms of, burnout and what we were trying to accomplish and what have you. So, yeah, burnout is a raw, real, painful thing that you can put other tags on it. You could call it depression. You could throw in moral injury for sure. Um, but having lived through it, I can see why many of our colleagues ultimately don't and are no longer with us. And that's a tragedy.
Even your willingness to write this down and put it out there and say, we need to have a conversation around that, it is so powerful and important, because I think in medicine, the culture is such that we are expected to care for others. And from the very beginning, the emphasis is on caring for others at our own expense, and actually at the expense of our family members and our significant others and others around us. And although it's a wonderful mission, and like you, I have loved working with my patients over the years, it creates this dissonance where you never feel like you can actually speak about your own emotions. You can never bring forward your own experience. And it becomes this thing that kind of turns in on you over time, and then is kind of hidden. And then it gets perpetuated by not talking about it with anybody else. So I think your willingness to bring this out and be honest about it, even as you are seeking positive change forward, that says a lot. And I'm wondering if you've had any interesting interactions with other people who are in the medical field as a result of putting this into the world.
Oh, for sure. It's the last year has been an amazing, interesting journey since we published the book. Um, Being a physician, you're not an expert writer and you don't know how to publish and all these other things. So we had gone through that whole process relatively successfully and self-published because frankly, I didn't want to be censored. I didn't want an editor telling me what to say. And so Joshua and I pretty much did it all on our own with some help of some key individuals. Um, but once we published it, it was like, okay, great. What do we do now? And it was really when I got on LinkedIn, amazingly enough, that I started to have just conversation after conversation with our colleagues around the country and really actually around the world now who are experiencing similar things and are clamoring to talk about it, are wanting desperately to have resources to deal with it themselves, and are so appreciative that somebody, and not just me, but there's many of us out there who have started to talk about this and are so appreciative that we're being honest and getting it out there. And now they feel empowered to take action or to say no or to push back on some of the ridiculous clerical burdens that exist. And that's just one example. It's been in the hundreds of our colleagues I've talked to, and maybe even more than that at this point. Um, and it just fills me up to realize like what initially started as maybe a labor of love and some catharsis for myself has created a vehicle for others to do the same. And it's amazing. I'm almost speechless at times thinking about the impact that ripple of change has had to this point, not just for myself but for my friends, my colleagues, my family who have had some healing as a result of it.
Todd, do you think that Joshua had any level of healing around this? I mean, I think in the end, my understanding is that you no longer are practicing in the same place. So you no longer have the doctor-patient relationship, but he had his own complicated relationship with medicine and healthcare. I'm not asking you to speak for him, but in your conversations with him, did you recognize any level of healing there?
Oh, 100%. So, and it's probably worth telling the story a little bit how Joshua got involved with the book in and of itself. So I had been caring for Joshua for about a decade, when the book was really kind of going full steam, if you will. And I created a mess for him from a health perspective with a medication that I wrote for him with devastating side effects. And it got even worse when he tried to come off of it with the withdrawal syndrome. Um, it was an SNRI. And ironically, it's the exact same drug that I take for my post-concussive headaches. And so I was literally running out of ideas for him. We had tried injections for his neck pain. He had cervical radiculopathy. And for the casual listener, that's a pinched nerve in the neck causing pain down the arm, if you will. We had tried referrals, analgesics, physical therapy. I mean, heat, traction, everything under the sun. And so I had had a decent response, or actually a pretty good response, with viloxazine for neuropathic pain, meaning nerve pain, and I offered it to him, and it just created this mess. And so as we're going through this, and I'm struggling to figure out how to help him, I told him about the book. Joshua is a very bright guy, very articulate, big heart, good dad, all that kind of stuff. And I started telling him about the quadruple aim, and he's giving me like the deer in the headlight looks, like, what are you talking about, Dr. Otten? What's the quadruple aim? But he had enough belief and faith and wanted to support me, that he seemed interested. And he's like, well, what do I write about? And I literally just said, just write. That was my only instructions to him. And so he did. And he wrote a very beautiful piece that's actually in the book, about his son in an ER visit. And from there, we had a meeting and we talked about kind of my vision initially. And it was really when he got involved and we talked about the yin and the yang, which was Joshua's idea, that it took on a very different trajectory. And the target audience became really massive at that point. And it wasn't being written towards physicians and administrators. It was being written for everybody to say, okay, what's really going on behind the scenes? Like, why are patients frustrated? Why are doctors miserable? Like, what's happening here, and how do we take it to a different place? Um, and so, yeah, it was magical. And back to actually answering the question, I suppose, which was, did Joshua get some catharsis out of it? 100%, 100%. So there was a point where a little bit further down the line, he had come back in for a visit, and I told him, Joshua, I believe you're going to get better, but you have to believe it too. And I'm tearing up just thinking about it, because he did start to get better. He did have the catharsis of writing. He did start to deal with his emotions and do some other things to fill up his cup. And is his health perfect? No. I mean, he had to go on testosterone and Synthroid as a result of side effects from another drug. But is he in a better place? Does he appreciate balance? Does he set boundaries? Yeah, and he would absolutely tell you that. And our relationship went from doctor patient to, I consider him a brother. I love the guy. We text each other daily. It's just been an incredible ride.
One of the things that I've thought a lot about over the last, say, 10 years or so is how we balance the absolute need for privacy and protecting patients' stories, and to some extent, I guess, protecting maybe our own stories, but also the absolute need to share stories. I mean, Joshua obviously co-authored this book, so he is sharing his own medical story, so you're not violating HIPAA because he's talking about himself. And then when you're talking to me, you're talking about something that Joshua has put out there. But I think as HIPAA was very, this rule that made it so that we really shouldn't be talking about anybody with anybody other than the person themselves. Very important. And in data privacy time, absolutely. But I think we've lost something. I think we've lost the ability to learn from stories that we maybe might have shared once, in let's say the doctor's lounges that used to exist before everything went digital.
I agree with you. And I think in medicine, things have gotten to be very black and white. And that whole gray area where medicine exists has been, frankly, lost at times. And when everything is seen as yes or no, or as I said, black and white, it causes problems. And I think there's ways to continue to have the conversations, but also respect HIPAA, right? As an example, the book is full of things from patients that they said, or stories that are similar, right? But take out the key identifiers, change the names. It doesn't have to be, call it person, blue sky. It doesn't, be creative with it, and you can still have those moments of healing. And honestly, there were a lot of my patients that specifically wanted their name included in the book, particularly with like the jokes that were included, um, and very much were advocating for it. And so I think we've lost our way a little bit in that regard. And I think we need to realize that medicine absolutely is a world of gray, and we need to be thinking about how do we navigate those waters and allow for healing with not only with patients but with our colleagues, because we cannot continue to have a physician a day dying in this country by their own hand because of the way the system has been set up and organized. I mean, that's a tragedy. And it results from all these layers of things that we're talking about. The fact that clinicians at times feel like they can't discuss a devastating case because of HIPAA, we got to work around that. We have to do better. We just have to.
Yeah, and you're referencing something that I think many of us have been touched by and also doesn't actually get discussed. I mean, here in Maine, we have absolutely had physicians die by their own hand, and I've known many of them. And yet even that doesn't really get talked about because, and maybe, maybe it should be some sense of shame that we in the healthcare setting actually have over not being willing to talk about it. But when someone follows through with suicide, there was a whole trajectory that led up to that point. And so by not talking about it at all, it kind of continues to place the blame squarely on the shoulders of that individual. And that's just not really fair, because I think particularly in medicine, although certainly other settings where people do follow through with suicide, it could also be true. But in healthcare, there are a lot of things that are stressful that on a daily basis are contributing to people's inability to just make it through and see light on the other side.
I agree. And I think these conversations are so important to continue to talk about it and make the average American aware of how big of a problem this is. And so I talk about it a lot, right? And it's become sort of second nature for me to be talking about the issue of physician suicide. But when I bring it up to somebody who's not a physician or pretty well versed in the healthcare space, they are shocked at the rate that they can't believe it. And I'm like, yes, this has been not only happening now, but it's been going on. And there are so many factors that contribute to it. And I think, unfortunately, the way our system is set up with profits over people in the vast majority of instances and churning out numbers and RVUs and volume and all these other things, it it's just going to continue until we reverse some of these things. But having said that, though, I don't want to dwell on the negative. I think there's many wonderful organizations out there who are working on this. The Lorna Breen Foundation is a perfect example of this, based on the unfortunate passing of an ER physician during, the COVID pandemic. The Medical Society of Virginia and their work with Safe Haven and several other states that are starting to work on those real barriers to mental health treatment for clinicians. We can start to turn this around, but I think that's just part of it. I think the emphasis on, frankly, money at the core of healthcare delivery too often is a big, big problem and needs to change.
I tend to agree with you. And having been in senior leadership positions, sitting in the C-suite, I have an understanding as to why we have gotten to that place. Because I also know that the current healthcare system as it's structured is very tenuous. So money gets put out there as the most important thing, which then kind of trickles down, and you have people who are working towards productivity and they're trying to churn people through. But then I've also sat, around the boardroom table, and I hear about, multi-million-dollar deficits that healthcare systems are struggling with. So I would suggest that we actually need to be thinking about solutions as to how we think about healthcare differently, how we fund healthcare, how we reimburse healthcare, because I think there are a lot of people who are trying to solve a problem that was created by a lot of different issues all at the same time. And I personally, this is my opinion, because my background is both in healthcare and in leadership, and I have a doctorate in leadership studies. I personally believe that we need to be leading differently in healthcare so that we could come up with different solutions in healthcare so that we can address the fact that money is necessary to keep the lights on, and also the way that things are structured now to create that money is killing people. And it's not just killing the physicians who may complete a suicide, but other clinicians, advanced practice providers, nurses are feeling the stress, people on the front lines, EMS. So how do we do that is my question. I mean, you are working on this quadruple aim, and I love that you're doing the ripple of change. Tell us about the quadruple aim, and where do we start with all of this?
For sure. My mind was going in a couple directions related to this because I often joke that I agree with you. We need to be working on solutions and not just talking about the problems. And I often will joke that we're trying to build the airplane as we're flying, which I guess might be a good time. I had a prop from my time in Brunswick, Maine. There's
I
a
love it.
P3. But to answer the question, I think there's a lot of different ways we can deal with this, and I'm a big fan of the quadruple aim. In its simplicity, in the book we call it our quadruple aim because we want everyone to feel like they have ownership of our healthcare system in one capacity or another. So the four tenets are patient experience, quality care, lower costs, and provider wellness. And I am fully aware that provider is a very triggering word for many individuals. In retrospect, I'm kind of glad we used it because it gets people thinking differently and talking and challenging the status quo. So if you don't like provider, change it. Healthcare professional, clinician, physician, whatever is appropriate in the moment. And really, that's what we want people to do with our quadruple aim. It's not meant to be black and white. It's meant to be molded and malleable and used in whatever your situation is to make it work. Because when you really pay attention to those four tenets, which is akin to the quintuple aim when you throw the R in front of it, which is the health equity piece. And I know I'm throwing a lot of stuff out there, but it can be magic. It can be magic. I've seen it work. I've seen it work at the office level. I've seen it work at the hospital level, the system level, the ACO level. And I think if we start to get the right framework and foundation, if you will, it could work at the national level. What is one of the ways that we're going to do this? Well, I think I've got some colleagues who are working on building towards an impact network with the Healthcare Reinvention Collaborative. And I think there's going to be little pieces to the puzzle that come from different entities. There are so many wonderful organizations around the country trying to do positive things. Unfortunately, many of them are doing them in their own little silo. And we've got to learn how to take and share the best from one another to come up with the ultimate solution. And I don't think it's going to be one thing. I think it's going to be a whole host of things. Legislative changes related to credentialing, direct primary care, I think is a fascinating model that might play a part to this. There's talk of community-based care delivery and an example of housing being connected, like the work Mark Smiley's doing in North Carolina. So there's all these little pieces around the country happening. I think if we can get an impact network together where people can share best practices and what's working in certain instances and then celebrate and shout those things, that's when I think we're going to start to see some real traction in the right direction. Because there are many areas that are doing wonderful things, and we need to celebrate those areas. So that's my vision. So I don't think there's a simple answer to this. I don't think it's a flipping of the switch, if you will. I think it's going to take a lot of work of a lot of people collaborating and ultimately getting to policy changes that are for the benefit of the majority, not the few.
I agree with you. And a big part of the work that I do that's related to leadership, but also practitioner wellness, and that's the word I just happen to have picked because it seems to make sense to me. I also agree that provider can be very triggering because it just seems like almost a very nondescript way to describe people that have spent a lot of time and effort getting their educations and learning how to care for people. So I think it was an insurance company term, and that's probably why it triggers people. So I use practitioner.
Yeah, it can be very divisive, that's for sure.
Yes, absolutely. And I personally think that this has everything to do with learning how to communicate both within the medical profession, but also outside of the medical profession, not making an assumption that because we are in healthcare, all of the solutions have to come from within healthcare, understanding that other professions have equally valid, if not even more valid, approaches to things like, let's just say, burnout, maybe moral injury, but certainly healthcare economics, health equity. And I think one of the things that we may not have emphasized quite enough in the last, let's just say 20 years, is how do we actually talk with people in different ways outside of medicine? Because my specific experience in training was very much still in the doctor at the top of the pyramid, doctor is God model that is probably, a century old. And I don't think we can live there anymore. I think we need to understand we are not the gods. Healthcare is not the heaven. We all need to be able to talk to one another. And that means, me talking to you across the country, you talking to people around the world and talking to different people, no matter what their specialty is. So how do we help people communicate with one another?
Well, I think there's probably a lot of layers to the question here. I think active listening is key. I think relationships are key. I think being open-minded to other possibilities or solutions is key. And it's not that you need to agree with everything, but for goodness sakes, you really should at least listen. And as a physician, I think one of my strengths was the capacity to tell my patients when I wasn't sure or that I didn't know and I needed to get help or we needed to order a test. Forcing something into a box has happened way too much in medicine. You can even see it with diagnoses that come out of, pick an area. And I won't get into examples, but I think you are spot on that we need to learn how to work with other industries. We need to think about how new technology is potentially going to play a role in this. And don't get me wrong, I am not saying technology is the answer. I think the human interaction in healthcare, that relationship is the most powerful thing that exists. And I don't believe that's going to be replaced. And I'll go back to the book, the relationship that I have with Joshua and the healing that we both got out of our relationship, you can't replicate that with technology. I don't care what you do. You're not going to come up with that. And I seriously doubt ChatGPT is going to come up with a prescription to just right is the only thing you tell the patient. But having said that, I do think generative AI is going to play a role and be beneficial. There's going to be pros and cons to that. And I think there needs to be human oversight. I actually believe the blockchain has a big role to play in this, and particularly with medical records and access to information. But the existing silos, perhaps the simplest way to think about this is silos are pervasive in healthcare right now. And they create so many problems, I can't even begin to describe it. And that needs to go away. And we also need to pull down the silos and the walls to other industries that have insight to help us get to a better place. So I envision the solutions are going to come from a much more collaborative space. And to go back to the leadership component too, I think we need clinicians, physicians, nurses, pharmacists, medical assistants, whatever, at the highest levels of leadership who are in it for the right reasons, whose altruism exceeds whatever whiffum they've got to help lead us out of this mess. And maybe I'm overstating a little bit, but I truly believe that's going to be paramount.
Yeah, and I tend to agree with you. And I would also say that, traditionally the way we've approached leadership is the people who lead are the people who have been assigned the leadership role. And it doesn't necessarily correlate. Certainly as physicians, I think you and I probably were given the benefit of some You have a doctor in front of your name, so therefore you must be a good leader. And I think that understanding that there are actually skills and attitudes, knowledge, behaviors that can lead to more and less effective leadership, and not simply just going with this is what we've always done from a management standpoint. I think that's going to be important moving forward.
Well, and the other thing too, and this has been very clear to me in the last year or so. So much like you, Lisa, you've probably always been in leadership positions, I'm guessing throughout your life. And if I'm wrong, forgive me for that. But I've always found myself in leadership positions, even from high school when I was a supervisor at Parks and Recreation, up and through the Navy and into residency and beyond. And, as a young physician, I got put into leadership roles that I was not expecting to be in at all, with like mergers of hospital systems. And I had only been to the place for like a year. Um, the point I'm trying to make, though, is in the last year, it's a lifelong process of learning. And I think the best leaders are the ones that are willing to have that introspective look and say, oh boy, that wasn't the best what I was doing 10 years ago, being an accidental diminisher or hijacking a meeting or having blind spots when it comes to this, that, or the other thing. I think the best leaders are the ones that take that stuff on board and say, okay, how can I do better? How can I serve others better? How can I become a better servant leader? And in the last year, I've really tried to take a lot of those things on board, and it's been fun. It's been hard at times. There's been some frustrating moments for sure, but it's great to learn something new and meet all these people. And I think the other thing that I just find just so uplifting, there are so many great leaders out there who feel trapped. And we've got to help empower those individuals to get in the right positions, to get their voices out there, to make a difference. And yeah, so there it is. I don't know. There's a lot packed into that, I suppose, but sometimes I just get on a roll.
At the end of the day, I think what you're saying is true, that we're talking about a complex system that's gotten to where it is for a variety of complex reasons, not all of which are from within actual medicine or healthcare. And it is going to require a lot of people working on it in a lot of different ways. And I think for me, trying to understand as a leader and also working with other leaders, the path forward is going to be more collaborative, is going to be more of a transformational mindset versus a poverty-oriented mindset where you're thinking, oh no, we have to keep doing what we always did because we don't know what the future looks like. I think there's going to need to be more agility, more flexibility of thought, as we've already talked about, the ability to communicate with other people. And I think of leadership, honestly, as a practice, the same way that medicine is a practice, because what I came into being a doctor with was just the beginning of what I've used over the years as a doctor. And leadership truly is no different. But we can't expect people to know how to do this until they've spent time practicing. And without actual reflection on what has occurred as a result of leadership behaviors, we're not going to move any further forward.
Well, and I think to piggyback on that a little bit, I think we're in a climate where failure is seen as the end game for this, that, or the other thing. And if we're gonna move the needle in healthcare to a better place, there are going to be failures. And I'm not advocating that we want to fail, and I'm not advocating that we want to make big mistakes, but I think we also need to be understanding that and appreciative of that they are going to happen, and we need to learn from them and take it to a better place. And I'll give you an example. I recently took a part-time job with an emergency physician group in Grand Rapids called Emergency Care Specialists. They've been around for 40 years. It's physician-led, forward-thinking, very much, believes in the quadruple aim and value and patient experience and wellness and all these other things. And they talk about that. And they're upfront with it. Like, we're going to take some calculated risks. We're not going to take risks that are foolish, we're gonna take risks that we think are gonna benefit the patients and gonna benefit the clinicians, provide better access and better care. And are we going to fail at times? Yes. And we're okay with that. But we're not gonna stop trying. And that kind of attitude, I think, needs to be replicated at the highest levels and appreciated at the highest levels. Because currently, you look at the number of deaths related to medical error in this country, depending on your sources, anywhere from, 250,000 to 400,000 per year. We're failing on a pretty regular basis with what we're doing. And so we got to think differently about how, when we make these changes, that we're going to screw up sometimes, and we're all human beings and we've got to learn from it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think that the other side of doing, say, a root cause analysis and having it come down to being a person's fault, which it almost never is. I mean, there are some people who make bad choices as clinicians or any other role that make it absolutely that person's fault. If you cut off the wrong leg and you're the one with a scalpel, that is probably your fault. However, a lot of systems things lead up to this. And I think this idea that we find the one person to be the scapegoat, that just always keeps us on this us versus them. It's somebody else's fault. We're not going to try to work on the system because we found the person who created the problem. And so you're right. I think understanding what that looks like and being willing to fail, because failure is learning. Failure is learning and growing. And if we don't make changes, I worry that my son, who just finished his emergency medicine residency, that if we don't try to figure out our way through this, then we're not going to be moving in a better direction for him and for his colleagues that are, just finishing their education, which means we're not going to move in a better direction for all the patients that we're trying to care for in our communities.
Agreed. And we need your son's generation to help lead us out of this. I think it's going to be the generation before us, but more importantly, the generation after us, who's going to be in the middle of all this, really leading us out of the existing problems with healthcare delivery in the United States. And frankly, there's problems all around the world. We're not alone with this. We're just really good at spending a lot of money to do it. And which is a problem in and of itself. But that's where I think groups like Medicine Forward are very interesting, because it's this amalgamation of a lot of positive change agents who are willing to think, willing to talk, willing to push back on ideas, speak their mind without that fear of reprisal or reciprocity, or however we want to describe it, that is so valuable. We need to have that. And interestingly enough, and I'm not getting into the specifics, but we were working towards a big project, and it sounds like it's semi-imploding. And I was talking to one of the other leaders yesterday, and we had a whole range of emotions about it. But in the end, we're like, you know what? We learned from this. Let's take this segment of a failure, utilize what we learned, and do something even better and something greater to create a landscape for your son that is a joy to work in again. And so it's love, and those days float by like I'm sure you've had, that they magically do. So yeah, I think it's going to be key, the collaboration, working together, thinking differently, all the things that we've kind of touched on. It's a joy to talk about these things. And a big part of the reason why I joke that I'm not going to shut up about it until we see some differences, because I think when we do this, not only do clinicians feel empowered by it, but patients do as well, right? Like, I can't, for patients that are listening to this, and frankly, we're all patients, write a thank you card to your doctor. Write a thank you card to your pharmacist. Tell them how much you appreciate them. Not everybody will, but the vast majority will. And it might make the biggest impact that you could ever imagine. Just that simple of a thing.
So, Todd, one of the things that I really have enjoyed coming out of COVID, which obviously was a terrible, terrible thing for so many people around the world, but it also kind of strengthened this idea that we're much closer as humans than we probably realize. And so the fact that I'm sitting here having this conversation with you, and that there are a lot of people who are offering virtual care that, are connecting with people around the country, and that technology is actually enabling all this to happen, I think it does bring us back to this idea that we don't need to engage in othering behavior, because you and I, even though we don't live anywhere near each other, I mean, we have the shared connection. You have your many years in the military. My family's in the military. I live very close to where the Brunswick Naval Air Station once was. I used to practice across the street from the Brunswick Naval Air Station where you used to practice. And that is the thing that, for me, is actually the hope for the future, is that not only are a lot of people doing a lot of interesting things in other areas, but there's not as many barriers to actually reaching out to people and having these conversations. So for me, it was really worthwhile to read your book and then be saying to myself, oh, we have this connection, just like I think many of us have with many other people, perhaps without realizing it.
Well, I think it speaks to that, to go back to the book a little bit. And it's kind of funny because neither Joshua nor I can remember who actually came up with the title, which is kind of ironic. But that ripple effect, right? That synergy that can be had with just two individuals. And how does that additive collective energy get not only beyond the ripple, but really hopefully waves of not just change, but positive change for the vast majority. And I agree with you. With Medicine Forward, we've got a core group of 10 of us that are in the quote unquote traction team. And literally, I have only met two of them in person to this point, but I consider all of them great friends. And that it speaks to the power of how technology can advance these initiatives. And so I absolutely agree with you. It was fascinating in COVID. They were wanting us to do Zoom calls with everybody because the reimbursement was better. And you talk about a nightmare trying to get like an 85-year-old to figure out how to do a Zoom call to do the visit. So I just really defaulted doing things on the telephone. And, as a family physician, you have that luxury of knowing your patient panel very well, as you're well aware of. And I could do 95% of what I could do on the phone that I could do in person because I knew the people. And we accomplished so much. So I totally agree with you. I think it's an amazing evolution that's occurred, and really a silver lining, if you will, as a result of the pandemic.
I'm Dr. Lisa Belisle, and I've been talking with Dr. Todd Otten today on Radio Maine, where we celebrate creativity and the human spirit. Dr. Otten is a board-certified family physician with over 20 years of experience in healthcare, and also the author of the book Ripple of Change, which he has co-authored with his patient Joshua Judy. I encourage people who are interested to pick up Todd's book because it's very interesting, and certainly for me sparked a lot of thoughts about how to work forward in a positive direction. And Todd, I appreciate your taking time out of your day to have this conversation with me today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.